Hello, Food Studies. This is Melanie Dupuis. I'm a professor of environmental studies and science at Pace University, and I'd like to talk to you about a project I'm working on I call the Political Ecology of Pizza. First, I would like to thank Katie Lebesco, Michelle Hill, and the rest of the Food Studies Conference Committee for inviting me to give this plenary today. So why pizza? Well, I think it's particularly pertinent to food studies in the Food Studies Research Network because these are the themes of the Food Studies Research Network. First, food production. We're going to be talking a lot about production today, and we're going to be talking about sustainability. Also, we're talking about milk here, and there's very little out there that is more about nutrition and more conversations about nutrition than milk and health, and the controversies around milk and health. And then finally, there are few commodities in the world that are not more political than milk, and we're going to see some of those politics and policies today. And finally, there's the special focus on making the local. And my argument here is that, in fact, milk while we have movements to relocalize our food system, during the decades when that movement has arisen, milk has become increasingly delocalized, and we want to look at what are the factors that are delocalizing the milk system. So another reason why I think it's a good idea to think about pizza is that we eat a lot of pizza, in particular young men, as we can see in this chart, eat an extraordinary amount of pizza. And in any day, that there's a 30% chance that a young man between a quarter, there's a 25 to 26% chance that young men are going to be eating pizza on any one day. And all Americans, there's a 1 in 8 chance that any American is going to be eating pizza on any day. And it's, as you can see, men more than women. Secondly, millennials, when surveyed about what they thought was a great food, think that pizza is, as they say, the best food in the world. And these are coming from something called the Pizza Power Report, which I think is a pretty fun report. And it's a marketing report on pizza. And they surveyed folks, and this is what they came up with. So we have a huge number of people in the United States, millennials in the United States, who think that pizza is the manna of food. And pizza is a huge industry. You can see that the pizza market in the United States, which a lot of people consider saturated, is a many billions of dollars of sales a year. But look at the worldwide market, which is even larger. The number of pizzerias is extraordinarily large, and so on. So this is another Pizza Power fact that I thought was kind of interesting, and I think tells you why pizza is so important. And the pizza market is expanding. The growth in pizza, look at China, 21%. And this is a forecast, five-year forecast, also by the same marketing group. And you can see that it's a huge percentage of forecasted growth around the world. And pizza franchises have been globalizing. I don't know if you follow pizza in the business news, you'll find that Pizza Hut is not doing that well. They're closing plants in the United States. Even Domino's is a little shaky right now, but globally they're doing very well. Pizza Hut in particular is expanding around the world. So then why a political ecology of pizza? Why do we have to think about pizza in terms of political ecology? And that's what I'm going to... I think pizza is in fact a wonderful example of the political ecology of food. And why? Because you have to think about pizza in terms of all of these factors to really understand it. And one of the things I want to maybe disappoint those of you who want to hear about wheat and tomatoes, that when I'm thinking about pizza, I'm thinking about cheese. I'm thinking about pizza cheese, and I'm thinking about mozzarella. And so this is really going to be a talk about pizza cheese. But the political economy of pizza cheese doesn't sound quite so good, but that's really what I'm talking about. And the political economy of pizza cheese is very interesting in terms of its economics, its politics, which are also dairy politics, the ways in which the rise of pizza cheese has changed the space of dairying, how that space of dairying has changed the nature of dairying, and how it's also related to the consumers that we have been just talking about in terms of how important pizza is in the United States, and in particular the bodies of those consumers, particularly those young men who eat so much. So yes, there we go, pizza cheese. This is my lame attempt to put all of those factors in a political economy into a pizza. So my argument is, to really understand pizza, you have to understand all of these slices, all of these different slices of the political economy of pizza. So like I said, my focus is on pizza cheese, and you really can't talk about dairy and start talking about the economics of pizza cheese without talking about this old adage, which is that there are 3 people in the world who understand dairy pricing and the politics of dairy, and 2 of them are dead. And honestly, that's pretty much correct. So I don't pretend to be one of those 3 people, but I think I know enough to understand this, which is that dairy pricing is split into 2 major kinds of pricing, and that is fluid milk, which gets a higher price for farmers, in part because you pay a higher price for that milk that arrives fresh in the refrigerator of your grocery store, hopefully. And so it's a way, when farmers get higher prices, they're more able to cover their costs. Lower prices are given to farmers, and what you pay in the store or in where you buy your cheese, whether it's in processed food or whole cheeses. And farmers receive less for the milk that they provide for manufactured milk. And this is a very important aspect of milk politics. So I wrote a book about dairy, the politics of dairy, called Nature's Perfect Food: How Milk Became America's Drink, about 13 years ago. It was published, and here's the argument I made, which is this is a map that was in a 1925 dairy economics bulletin, and which was republished in an article that Danny Block and I did a while ago. And the deal is, as we talked about in terms of both the New York milk market and the Chicago milk market that Danny talked about, is that farmers would get more money for fluid milk, and therefore the farmers around urban areas would tend to get these higher prices because they were part of something called a milk shed. And the idea was that they created in the 1930s market orders that enabled farmers who provided milk for these milk sheds to get these higher prices, and that enabled these farmers to be able to make a living and get high enough prices to be able to stay in business. Now, did that totally cover their costs? Not always, but that's a very long story. But the deal was that children, in particular in these urban areas, were undernourished, and rather than the argument I make in Nature's Perfect Food is, rather than providing higher wages for urban consumers, the deal was to create cheap food, and milk was the number one part of that deal. Is that if we create this nutritious food that enables your children to grow tall and strong, that agitating for higher wages is not as necessary. And so that became sort of the cheap food deal that is still very much in a process today. But here's the problem. Dairy milk consumption has gone down. Okay, so this is the consumer part. This is the body's part. Consumers are drinking less and less milk. Now, of course, if you ask, and you can see this was true in the 1970s, way before almond milk, okay? If you ask a dairy farmer why consumers are drinking less milk, the first thing they'll say is it's those almond milk producers. But in fact, if you ask a dairy farmer in the 1970s or 1980s, why are consumers drinking less milk? The first thing they would say is soda, Coca-Cola. They're drinking too much Coke and they're not drinking enough milk. So there's always this idea that the reason why the dairy industry has been in crisis for decades has been because dairy farmers have not been able to meet their expenses, right, and haven't been able to cover their expenses because dairy consumers have been abandoning them. Okay, this is the story that people tell. Now remember then that the fluid milk is where farmers get higher prices. So this is a real problem when it comes to the old deal, which is that if you make sure consumers drink a lot of milk, farmers will be able to make a living. So here are here's some of the plant-based alternatives that folks talk about, and you see, yeah, there's some growth in these categories, but I would argue that these are not the main problems. Now, ironically, this is, the ultimate irony here is that as fluid milk consumption goes down, milk production is in fact going up. Okay, so consumers are drinking less and less of the high-priced commodity that enables producers to make a living, but then production is in fact increasing. So what we see here in terms of politics is that the dairy pricing is the end of the deal. There's no longer possible to make the deal that we made, that farmers around milk sheds, remember these milk sheds, these places in the Northeast that were increasingly being outcompeted in terms of vegetables and grains and so on, corn, that they were able to still make a living by producing milk for the cities. Instead, what we have is this huge dairy surplus. I mean, this dairy surplus has been a political factor for a huge amount of time, and over the last several decades. And the question is dairy management. How do we manage this surplus? And so this is this is sort of the struggle that has been happening. So here's how it's affecting farm income, and you can see that red line is where farmers manage to make a living, that is, meet their expenses, and you can see that dairy farm income rarely, and in fact has rarely in general managed to the price of milk and the kind of income that dairy farmers make has seldom been in the last 15, 20 years. And even before that, the farmers have been very unlikely to be able to cover their expenses to make a real living. So, but what's going on here? Well, yes, we're drinking a lot less milk and cream, but we're eating a whole lot more cheese, a lot more cheese. And if you look at the then this is just till 2004, and it's increasing even beyond that. But why is their milk equivalent so much larger? Well, that's because milk is 87% water. So it takes 10 pounds of milk to make a pound of cheese. So the thing about supply management through manufactured products is that that's the way you get the water out of milk. Fluid milk, politically, as a way to maintain a local system, they have not allowed the water to come out of the milk at the farm in order to move milk around. So when those milk trucks are moving down the highway next to you, that that they're moving 87% water. So this is, but once you manufacture it into cheese, you've moved the water out of the product. And as you can see here, cheese production has skyrocketed since the 70s now, and we're going to talk a little bit as to why that's happening. And you can see, in particular, this time period. You can see, and I want to talk about this time period. And in fact, I'm going to talk in particular about 1984. 1984 it's perhaps not Orwellian, although one can think about some Orwellian aspects about what's. So who's making all of this cheese? Well, you can see Wisconsin has been the center of cheese production, and it has been the center of cheese production for a very long time. It's sort of the traditional center. Then you see some newcomers here. Well, California is not necessarily a newcomer. It has been making cheese for a while, but compared to some of the sort of traditional dairy states like New York and Minnesota, it's a relative newcomer. But the real newcomers are Idaho and New Mexico. Look at how they are even out-competing New York and Minnesota that are traditional dairy states nowadays. And what you see is a movement of milk production away from the sort of traditional dairy states. And you can see this between 1975 and 2000 in this chart, and toward the West. So we know that California is making a lot of cheese. In fact, they're making a lot of mozzarella cheese. Look at the percent of the rise in the production of mozzarella, and you can see in this study of this is another study that looks at the ways which areas have lost dairy production and which areas are gaining. And you can see the Idaho, you can see the New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. So, but these economists have argued is that in fact dairying is losing. Is losing several areas, and what they call these are cow islands. These are this is cows here, this is where the cows have been increasing and the cows have been decreasing over in this time period between 2001 and 2011, and that is continuing today. So this is an analysis I did of, and you can look at then, the economists looked at these sort of cow islands, but those cow islands are actually also cow municipalities. These are the counties which have been traditional dairy counties that have now moved mostly to the west, and that and remember that dairy, is a political relationship between the country, the surrounding countryside, and the countryside surrounding cities, and dairying is moving away from that traditional deal in terms of where it is spatially. That is, it's delocalizing from the areas where that deal had traditionally taken place. And this is not about cheese, but we're seeing a sort of delocalization even of fluid milk, as places like Walmart has come up with its own dairy processing plant in the middle of Indiana, where they are producing milk for their own milk for their own stores. All right, so once again here we can see that not only is milk moving west, but that the western dairy farms are much larger than the dairy farms in the traditional dairy areas, particularly you can see the southeast, the mountains, and the Pacific. And this is a 2000, this is from 20 years ago, and that difference has only increased. So where is all this cheese going? So there's a farm. I'm not talking much about dairy market orders today, but dairy market orders are the ones that pay fluid milk farmers more and manufacturing milk farmers less. But one of the things that the farmers do in order to make sure that the milk that they produce actually receives reasonable prices is they have something called a checkoff. And the checkoff pays an organization to market milk, and they're the same people who did the milk mustaches and the got milk and so on. But nowadays, one of the things they have been doing is they've been going directly to fast food franchises to convince them to put more cheese in their products. And if you order a cheese pizza nowadays from a place like Domino's, you're going to see a lot of cheese in it. And in fact, that you can see in this case, they put cheese into the crust. This is something that the dairy management folks really celebrate, is that they've managed to get Domino's to put cheese not just on the pizza, but in the crust. And then this burrito features not just cheese inside the burrito, but then they put grilled cheese around the outside of the tortilla, which I can't imagine trying to handle that burrito. But you can see there that they convinced Domino's to put even more cheese into there, and this is and around this burrito as well. So, like we said, we have more cheese being eaten, and so the question is around supply management is, what do you do with that supply? And the answer is, you put it into fast food, and you then basically put it into bodies. Now, this could be considered in terms of a supply management. In the 1970s, when there was too much milk, they put it into dry milk, and then they put that dry milk, they sent that dry milk out for food aid, and so they basically dumped milk into the bodies of people, starving people around the world. The strategy now is to put it into mozz, particularly pizza cheese and other kinds of processed cheese, and dump it into the bodies of people in the United States and around the world who eat fast food. So in particular, into the bodies of young American men and other pizza eaters. So how does this happen? Well, it's important to look at the history of cheese production in the United States to understand how we get to the rise in cheese consumption, the date that even dairy scientists talk about is 1984. And you can see in 1984 this rise in, all of a sudden, cheese consumption is taking off. And you can see it here as well, the rise in per capita consumption, specifically of Italian cheese. And Italian cheese, the most Italian cheese that is being produced is mozzarella cheese. So what is it that enables this rise in cheese consumption? Is a rise in cheese production, and cheese production specifically for processing. So the first thing and you can see these are dairy scientists talking about this milestone in terms of being able to control cheese production process, which is what they're talking about when they talk about the acid development. And understanding sort of the molecular chemistry of casein in order to meet specific requirements as demanded by the end-use application. The end-use application being for processing, and this is processing either for fast food pizza or other kinds of food processing. So, as it said, as Johnson and Lucy say, most of the cheese produced in the United States today is either processed or used as an ingredient in other foods. It's not just eaten on its own. And so this is what has happened, is this rise in cheese production for processing or fast food. The second thing that happens is, and this is, with the rise of genomics and biotechnology, as the production of cheese starts to grow, and this happens primarily through the creation of larger, because the cheese production can be now controlled, as cheese production is more controlled, you are able to build larger and expand plants. You can build larger plants and you can expand your processing plants. As the production of cheese expands, we actually end up with a rennet shortage. That is, that cheese requires the use of rennet. That is this chymosin that's generally found in the stomach of calves. But there weren't enough calves to harvest chymosin from, and instead, there was the GMO biotech formation of basically GMO chymosin that enabled, that is mostly what is used now, as opposed to rennet from calves. The third thing that happened was membrane technology. So what you wanted was milk that was super pure, and that by being able to control the genetically modified bacteria, the protein formation process, plus being able to control the milk itself that goes into the process, enables the creation of a much larger scale processing in the system. So these three technologies create this rise in megaprocessing. And you see this is a quote from, very recent quote, saying that dairy processors, that almost all dairy processing companies are expanding nowadays, and so on. And here's the capacity of dairy processing, and you can see it's California, it's New Mexico, have these very large volume milk processors. And those places are mostly, they're not the old dairy milk sheds that are built around cities. They are instead milk sheds built around mega processing, particularly mega cheese processing, particularly mozzarella processing, particularly around pizza cheese processing. As a result, we have this huge pizza industry in the United States. Increasingly, we are exporting pizza cheese around the world along with our franchises. And there's still a lot of small pizza chains. They still represent 40% of the industry, but there are still a majority are pizza chains. Now, what does that mean in terms of cows, in terms of the size of dairy farms? So you can see then that it's really during this time period that the size of dairy farms also skyrocket. So they're moving west and they're large farms. So what you're seeing are mega processing facilities with a small number of large dairy farms that are attracted to those areas around the processing facility. Often they are farmers who also have dairy farms in Wisconsin who come down, or Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, New York, who come down and build large-scale dairy farms in their area. And these mega dairy farms then are the ones that are serving these large dairy processing plants. So it's moving west, and it's becoming cheese, and it's becoming large farms around these cheese plants. So this is what's happening with these. So when people talk about the elimination or the competition or the loss of small dairy farms, they don't really talk about how the loss of small dairy farms are being outcompeted in the same places in terms of these mega dairies. These mega dairies are in a different part of the country and are outcompeting these smaller family farms. Um, so this is yet again, you could look at this pretty much any decade over the last couple of decades, but up until now, we've had a continual loss of dairy farms in the United States, and a rise in these mega farms. Now, this is so what does this have to do with nature? Okay, nature is the last slice of our pizza pie. And we need to think about then how does this affect nature? Now, this is from a report. This on the left here is from a report from the Institute for Agriculture um, and Trade Policy, looking at the environmental problems of large dairy farms. And what they say is that with the rise in these mega farms, there's also a rise in greenhouse gas emissions from these farms. And you can see that as the in the that the methane per kilogram of milk is rising on these as the dairy farms are dropping, um, and um, and so there's a rise in greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a serious issue around water because these mega farms are moving to places that have that are very dry, that have very scarce water resources, um, and and so the question is, how much water do they use, and then what impact do they have on water tables? Now, of course, these large-scale dairy farms have high-tech manure processing, but you still have to think about, as these dairy scientists discuss in this article on the sustainability of the U.S. dairy industry, is that livestock excrete 60 to 80% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that they consume. Therefore, if you have these mega farms, these nutrients that are coming from other parts of the country, from corn producing areas that are put through cows, are staying on the farm and are not being then exported away in the milk or the meat that the cows produce. And so one of the conclusions of these dairy scientists is that we should really think strongly about what are the policies that are encouraging the location or relocation of dairies in these areas that are with limited water from areas that are rich in water resources. And the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy note that there is very little public pressure, there's very little policy out there to hold these meat and dairy corporations accountable for their emissions, because even though there's high tech, high capital manure control facilities, there's always the possibility, when you have that much nitrogen and phosphate being introduced into an area, even if it's under serious control, is probably risky for those areas. So the question that I want to leave you with is, why are we risking the nature of these areas, the water, the air? Why are we creating policies that that create these mega farms that compete against the sort of traditional dairy areas? And these dairy areas, one of the reasons why I wanted to show you these dairy areas by counties is that the counties that are attracting these plants are being that are getting economic development funds to attract plants to these areas. The areas where dairy plants and dairy cows and dairy farms um, are leaving are becoming economically sort of de-industrialized or de-agrified, really. And it's a severe problem for these areas in order because dairy farming is a major aspect of the economy in these areas, which tend to be areas that have traditionally been part of milk sheds, that have been part of the old deal where farmers around cities were producing milk for the urban areas. That even that deal seems to be moving. We're moving away from even that deal. That these dairy areas are being out competed and um, becoming increasingly economically distressed. And so, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to distress areas economically, distress areas in terms of nature? Um, and thirdly, why do we need to consider young men the dumping grounds, men's bodies the dumping grounds, or even the bodies of Americans in general, the dumping grounds for these kinds of cheeses, which, you know, I love cheese. I'm happy to eat plenty of cheese, but to create fast foods where there's so much cheese in it that it's utterly unhealthy means that the third bad impact of all of this is in the bodies of people. So we're affecting nature, we're affecting the economies of these regions, we're affecting space, and we're affecting people's bodies. And the Institute for Agriculture Trade Policy argues that the way we deal with this is by creating a process of of control. If we had this is a kind of dairy policy where you control the surplus rather than trying to dump it into bodies, where you control the surplus rather than creating these mega plants to process it. And if we could instead control the surplus, we would have fewer greenhouse gas emissions. We would have um, less dumping, and we would have possibly be able to maintain the economies of the more traditional dairy areas. Thank you.